Hello everyone, and welcome back to Game Easy Roll Good. Today we're actually going to take just a quick look at the availability of the wizard spells by the spell school, because we just saw their new ideas about the revisions of the wizard subclasses around the spell schools. They released some of them already with the player's handbook. There's 4 missing that haven't been released, but we saw that in the recent Unearthed Arcana, and all of them have this one particular feature that allows them to get an additional spell of that particular school every once in a while. So I just kind of wanted to take a look at how many of those spells exist at each level for each of those spell schools, and see if there's kind of any gaps that we might run into if you're playing the wizard. We're going to take a look at both the wizard spell list as it's written in the player's handbook for 2024, as well as the wizard spell list considering just all spells that have been released, and then of course not including anything that is considered legacy according to D&D Beyond at least. But when I finished my Build-A-Bard series and I was thinking about kind of doing the same thing for the wizard subclasses, at least for the ones for the specific spell schools, to see kind of how being able to pick up a spell from those spell schools specifically every once in a while might change my decisions when building that wizard. It got me thinking about how many spells are there of each one, and I know I kind of looked at this kind of on my own once before, specifically for divination, because there's just so few divination spells specifically. But let's just go ahead and get started, starting with the actual feature that I'm talking about here. And this is all regarding becoming a Savant. So every subclass for the wizard that is for the specific school of magic, like the Evoker, the Illusionist, the Abjurer, for example here, they all have this Abjuration Savant, Evocation Savant, Divinate, whatever Savant, where it says that you choose 2 wizard spells from the whatever school of magic that your subclass is, which must be no higher than level 2, specifically when you get this feature, and then add them to your spellbook for free. So when you get this feature at level 3, you get to add 2, for example, Abjuration schools to your spell list for free, in addition to the spells that you also get at that level. And then it then continues to say that in addition, whenever you gain access to a new level of spell slots in this class, you can add 1 wizard spell from the school of magic that your subclass is to your spellbook for free. The chosen spell must be level for which you have spell slots. So initially, actually, I read this completely wrong, and I don't even know that anyone ever corrected me in the comments. I know I've read this wrong in the first place. I'm positive, because in my head I didn't know that it actually worked specifically like this. I originally thought that this gave you an extra spell from that spell school every time you leveled up in wizard. So basically you got 3 spells per level rather than just 2. One of them just had to be from your school of magic that your subclass is based around. But it's actually not that. It's only when you gain a new level of spell slots. So the fact that you get 2 spells at 3rd level when you get this feature is to make up for the fact that you didn't get to choose one before at 1st level when you got your first level spell slot, and then again here at 3rd level when you get your first 2nd level spell slot. And then of course you can see at the bottom that'll continue at levels 5 when you get 3rd level spell slots, and then 7, 8, and then 7, 9, 11, 13, 15 up to 17, and then it stops at 17. You don't get to add additional spells after that because we don't have 10th level spells, of course, let alone 10th level spell slots, of course, unless your DM is homebrewing. But if that were the case, if your DM for whatever reason gave you a 10th level spell slot with a 10th level spell, then technically at that point you could, according to the rules of this one, learn another spell from your spell school of any level at that point. While this is basically only half as good as I originally thought it was, I still think that these are very good features. Again, why I think that they put this in here was to kind of relieve the burden of the DM of needing to always put in spell scrolls and spell books in the wizard's way when they have a wizard in their campaign, or always having to remember to try to do that, because of course discovering and writing in new spells into their spell book is part of the wizard identity. This kind of makes up for that, at least for the particular subclasses. However, going from effectively 19 additional spells, which is what I originally thought that they only get 8 additional spells, which makes a lot more sense now that I think about it. That basically puts wizards on par with every other subclass that gets a subclass spell list. Those usually contain about 8 spells. The only difference here is that, of course, the wizard gets them over the entire course of their career. They don't get them unlocked only in the earlier levels like all the subclass spell lists do. They get them usually at like 3, 5, 7, and 9, and then they stop. So while these other subclasses that get specific subclass spell lists are very front-loaded with all their spells, they get them very early. Those spell lists usually stop at 5th level spells, whereas the wizard subclasses for the schools of magic can continue getting an extra spell at 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th level as well. So that's kind of how I think they intended to balance it. It makes a lot more sense now that I'm kind of thinking about it that way. I'm still a little disappointed. I think you could just give the wizard 1 additional spell from their spell school per level. Wizards do have the highest number of prepared spells, but they still can only technically prepare so many spells, and sort of being that flexible utility caster who can take the right spells at the right time is also just kind of another feature of the wizard, especially now that they have that memorized spell where they can switch out a prepared spell during a short rest. I think that would all work together. Again, 8 spells is definitely much less than 19 spells, but it makes sense. But I just wanted to point that out because I know that I definitely got that wrong. I've been saying it wrong throughout all my videos and no one's ever corrected me, so I'm sure other people maybe misunderstood that as well. So with that aside, we understand the feature. Again, we get 2 additional spells at 3rd level and then 1 every spell level beyond that. So let's go ahead and just start looking at the Abjuration spells and see how many Abjuration spells we have on the wizard spell list at each level. We can see that we have the number of spells on the top here that include pre-2024 spells, things from like Xanathar's, the Book of Many Things, other spells from the wizard spell list that were added then. And then the 2024 only is the spell list as it's written only in the player's handbook for 2024, because we haven't had any additional spells added at this time. We've seen some in Unearthed Arcanas, but we haven't seen any officially released just yet. We can see that the Abjurer wizard has at least 1 spell at every level to choose from. So for example, if you're trying to always pick a spell from your spell school at the time that you get that, like keep it on curve, like when you get your 7th level spells, you want to pick up the Abjuration 7th level spell. There's only 1 of them at that level, so you kind of are pigeonholing yourself into that one. But at least for the Abjurer, it's unlikely that they would ever be in a situation where they get a new spell slot and they don't have a spell of that spell school to pick at that level. Probably the more optimal, I say that very loosely, the more optimal move here is to just use the extra spells that you get from your spell school to pick up the key spells that you normally pick up for that spell school. For Abjuration, for example, that might be like your shields, your counter spells, dispel magic, your banishments, contingencies, and then maybe that'll open up some of your regular spells that you pick up to pick up other things that you wouldn't normally pick up. That's another reason I liked the idea of getting a spell from your spell school every level instead of every 2 levels up to level 17. But at least for Abjuration, again, we can see that this doesn't really cause any problems. So that's Abjuration. Let's go and then move on to Conjuration. So Conjuration actually has even more selection to choose from here. I think this is one of 3 schools of magic that has basically the highest representation of spells on the wizard spell list at least. Again, you're going to have a little bit more limited options if you're only using the 2024 rules, but you really shouldn't run into any trouble even if that's the case. And some of these spells that are in the pre-2024 counts may be very situational, or even setting specific spells like the Air Bubble from Spelljammer. Technically, Silvery Barbs being from Strixhaven might not necessarily be allowed anywhere if it's not just outright banned. But even just between Abjuration and Conjuration, we can see that some spell schools are just really spoiled for choice. So unless you're just kind of really picking every Conjuration spell on purpose for whatever reason, you just want to play a wizard that only picks Conjuration spells, which I don't think you could even pull off necessarily unless you just chose not to pick up spells at certain levels. But usually that's not the case. You're usually going to pick up, spells from other spell schools as well. So really you're not going to have too much trouble with Conjuration. But that brings us, of course, in alphabetical order to Divination. I was actually thinking about saving this one for last because, again, it just has the most trouble. We can see, regardless of which spell list that you're using, whether it's including pre-2024 content or just 2024 only content, there are no 7th level spells available for the wizard for Divination. So again, if you're trying to stay on curve and you're trying to pick a spell at the spell level for your spell school when you get that spell slot, you're not going to be able to do that for a Diviner when you reach level 13 and you get your 7th level spells. Not only that, but they also only have 1 Divination spell at 6th level as well as at 8th and 9th level. So in those situations, if you're trying to stay on curve, those are just kind of the spells that you have to pick because you only have 1 choice. And depending on the spell that it is, like True Seeing, you might be wanting to pick that up anyway. And if you're a 13th level wizard and you're getting your 7th level spell slot, at 11th level, you probably picked up True Seeing already just because it's the only 6th level divination spell. And then there's no 7th level divination spell to choose from. So you have to kind of go all the way back to your earlier divination spell. So it kind of feels a little inefficient. Not to say that it's always inefficient to choose a lower level spell when you have access to higher level spell slots. I'd say even sometimes that's probably the more correct move if there's very good lower level spells that you can choose from. But it always really struck me as odd, and especially post 2024 when they're making the 2024 player's handbook and they know that they're creating these Abjuration and Divination Savant features, that they wouldn't come up with a new spell to make sure that there's at least 1 spell at every level for a wizard to choose from. And if you could imagine that it worked the original way that I thought it did, where you pick up an additional spell at every level, you would be even in a worse situation where there might not even be enough divination spells to even do that. There's 3, 8, 11, 14, 18, 19. There's barely enough, assuming that you don't pick up any other divination spells with your normal spells that or learn any new divination spells from like finding spell books or spell scrolls. So Divination definitely has a bit more trouble trying to pick up new spells, but let's go ahead and move on to Enchantment. So Enchantment kind of surprisingly, I didn't realize that they had such low representation, at least on the wizard spell list, I guess. Especially if you're looking at only the player's handbook for the 2024, they have very few enchantment spells. I mean, at third level, you can see that in the 2024 player's handbook, there are no enchantment spells for the wizard at all. Whereas if you open it up to the secondary materials like Xanathars and whatever, then you suddenly have 5 enchantment spells at third level for the wizard. Same thing you can see there at level 7 again. There's 0 in the player's handbook, but only 1 in the expanded content. And this one's actually kind of surprising for me because I thought enchantment was much more well represented just in general as a school. And it's just really surprising to me that there's nothing at third level, because usually that's such a, you know, it's one of the biggest power spikes in the game when everyone reaches level 5 and gets access to their third level spells or their extra attack or whatever they're getting at level 5. It's arguably the biggest power spike in the game. The fact that there's just nothing at that level if you're only using the 2024 content so far, then that's just really interesting to me. That then brings us, of course, to the evocation spell. So evocation, unsurprisingly, has more than enough spells at most spell levels. It's only really at levels 8 and 9 that their decision is almost made for them. It is in fact made for them if you're choosing the spell at that spell level, if you're only using the 2024 player's handbook spell list. And I almost think it's a little bit ironic that there's so much choice here, because I personally feel, maybe that's because I don't normally play just a pure blaster, that you really need that many evocation spells such that you would want to pick one up at every spell level. Usually I just pick up a handful of good ones, and then all my other spells are either utility spells or control spells or do other things spells. But if I'm playing an evoker wizard, I'm really not going to say no to a free fireball or chain lightning or meteor swarm or just, you know, one free evocation spell at each level. I also just thought it was kind of funny that there are so many evocation spells early on and then they kind of taper off as you get into the higher spell levels. Of course, it's not uncommon to see less spells at the higher levels, but it almost kind of feels like, you know, the young wizards, the less experienced wizards, they just want to blow everything up. That's their solution to everything. But as they get a higher level, they realize that that's necessarily not always the solutions. So maybe they branch out into other disciplines and learn other ways to solve problems or something like that. I don't know. That's just kind of the way that the data presents itself to me, at least. So then moving on from evocation, we're going to look at the illusion school. So the illusion school is mostly okay. Well, it doesn't have nearly the amount of spells as like evocation as we just saw. It has enough spells at every spell level, assuming that you're using expanded content. If you're not using expanded content, then you have nothing at 8th level. And then even if you are using the expanded content, then of course your choice is kind of made for you at 8th and 9th level if you're picking spells at that level. However, I think this is also a situation where illusion, at least in my opinion, may be the only spell school where I think the quality of the spells gets worse as you get higher in spell level. Like a lot of the most fun illusion spells exist in the lower level spell slots, whereas, you know, weird at 9th level is, you know, it's a fine spell, I guess. And then I can't remember, I think it's programmed illusion at 8th level, very situational, very almost a role-playing spell almost. If you are an illusionist and you're high enough to get your extra 8th and 9th level spell, you might end up just going back to your earlier levels and picking up something at those lower levels, because I think those just kind of are the more fun illusion spells. So in that way, you're kind of negating the lack of selection at that spell level. But that's illusion. Let's go ahead and take a look at necromancy. Necromancy is kind of in a bit of trouble, especially if you're only, again, using the 2024 player's handbook spell list. There's even not really that big of a difference between the 2024 only spell list and the expanded content spell list. But if you are limited only to the 2024 content, then again, at 5th level spells, you have nothing to choose from as far as necromancy spells go. In expanded content, there's a few good ones at 5th level, like the Dance Macabre is a very fun one. Even early on at levels 1 and 2, assuming that you haven't picked up any necromancy spells, you might have an option, but you get 6 levels at level 1, and then 2 additional first level spells at level 2, and then 2 additional spells at level 3. So it's possible that you picked up already your 2 necromancy spells at level 1, depending on how, you know, on brand you're trying to be. So you might already be locked into the only spells you have to choose from. So that's a little interesting that even in these earlier levels, there's not really a lot of choice, and that's kind of something we haven't seen much in the other spell schools. And that's kind of surprising to me because, again, necromancy, I think, is a very popular school of magic. In my head, I thought there would have been more representation, but now actually being able to see the counts, so a little surprising to see. I definitely wouldn't have expected this from necromancy specifically. Divination, again, was already on my mind, but it's just another situation where I'm surprised that Wizards of the Coast didn't make an effort to try to fill these gaps, or at least make it so that it doesn't feel like a decision is being made for you when you get that extra spell, when you get that extra spell slot at that level. That was necromancy. Let's go ahead and move on to the final spell school of magic, and that is going to be transmutation. Transmutation is surprisingly, I guess in my head, surprisingly, the most spoiled for choice of all the spell schools. You can see that there's just tons of spells, especially early on. You know, there's 16 transmutation spells on the wizard spell list at 2nd level. If you're going for the expanded content, there's only 1 spell level where the choice is kind of made for you there at level 8, where you only have 1 transmutation spell if you're trying to pick up an 8th level transmutation spell. But everywhere else, even if you're only using the 2024 Player's Handbook, you are really almost spoiled for choice at almost every level, except for level 7, maybe. But if you would have asked me which spell school has the most number of spells, I probably would have guessed Evocation just as a knee-jerk reaction. Transmutation definitely surprised me, although I guess when I think about it, it makes a lot more sense. Conjuration did also kind of surprise me a bit. I didn't expect there to be so many Conjuration spells, although I guess with all the summon spells and everything, I guess those take up a lot of space as well. But basically, we can see that Conjuration, Transmutation, and Evocation are basically spoiled for choice. Divination, what was it, Illusion, and Necromancy definitely have some trouble, with Divination certainly being the worst, but Necromancy I think kind of being a close second there. And then all the other spell schools are just kind of somewhere in between. Well, I don't think it's necessarily feasible or even necessary for things to be so homogenized that there's the same number of spells on every spell list of every spell school. Again, it just really surprises me that they didn't make an effort to at least fill in gaps where there are clear gaps, or at least make sure that there's not only one choice at a given spell level, because they knew that they were going to put in these, Abjuration, Savant, these Savant type features, and you might be choosing spells at that spell school already just because there's good spells there. That's just, again, it's just very strange to me that there are gaps, knowing that they're going to make those decisions. Divination, I know, has always had sort of low representation in the kind of number of spells that it has. And I think understandably it's a little hard to design for the nature of that spell school. I also just kind of wonder if there's maybe like an in-universe reason why certain spell schools are less represented than others, at least among wizards. And these numbers alone might be enough if you are a DM, if you're considering whether or not you want to use only 2024 content or pre-2024 content as well. Especially if you have a wizard in your game, this might be a good reason to at least include these spells from the older content, just so that they have more choice with those Savant features. There might be, a few situations here and there where you maybe need to update the wording on a spell to make more sense within the confines of the 2024 rules. I don't think there's probably a lot of situations like that, but you may run into some. But I'm really curious for all of you, where there are gaps in these spell lists, and, Divination is the easiest one to pick on. I've personally toiled over the idea of what would new Divination spells look like. They don't need to be offensive spells. I know they've tried to do that with like Mind Spike. I don't know that that's necessarily the nature of Divination, is to try to do damage. So I kind of want to pass that question on to you, whether it's a Divination spell or maybe ways to fill in like Illusion or Necromancy spells, if there are things that you've come up with in the past for your homebrew, or if there's just ideas that you've had in general. What would those spells look like, especially if it's Divination, just because I think Divination just has the least representation, period. And I really just think that's a hard spell school to design spells for. I've even looked on D&D Beyond and the homebrew spells there for new Divination spells, and I think most of them aren't great. And I think that you could probably say that about a lot of homebrew in general. I would argue that the vast majority of them that I've seen wouldn't even qualify as Divination in my mind. Like one low level spell that I came up with once before was essentially a way for the wizard to copy spells more quickly in their spell book by sort of getting flashes and like memories of the person who originally wrote that spell book or wrote that spell scroll, to see how they did it and understand how they process their equations and their actions and maneuvers. So they would sort of like divine the information that way. And that basically cuts out the R&D that's basically supposed to be part of the time that it takes to copy spells into your spell book. But again, I'm really interested to know what you all think and kind of how you would fill in those gaps with again, specifically like Divination, the gaps in Necromancy even Illusion there, I think at like 8th level. Like what are some cool effects that you think qualify in those spell schools that maybe aren't well represented within the spell schools of Dungeons & Dragons? So let me know all that and more down in the comments below. And again, while you're going down to those comments, please hit that like button. If you are a new or returning viewer to this channel and you like what you saw here and you want to see more from me, please consider hitting that subscribe button and support the channel. I release videos every Wednesday, so you always have something to look forward to. I appreciate your time, and I'll see you in the next one.